Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to this series to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. One of my favorite things about making these videos is that the research rabbit holes twist and turn and occasionally lead me to realizations that I never thought I'd make. This video was originally going to simply be a peer review of an old presentation. I checked the math, validated some assumptions, all was going smoothly as it could without their data. But when I redid the presentation of their results with modern technology, never before seen patterns and counterintuitive truths presented themselves. And while pondering what they could mean, I may have made not one but two remarkable discoveries, just sitting there in 40-year-old data, hidden purely because of the way they were presented and how that presentation has propagated. For nearly 40 years, this image of a spiral density map has been passed around the Egyptology enthusiast community. You have almost certainly seen it before, possibly in a discussion about Jean-Pierre Houdin's internal ramp theory, which my intent was to debunk. But you probably have no idea where it comes from or even what it really represents. When looking at data, it is important to know these things, as if you are unaware of quirks with the presentation, you can very easily come up with incorrect conclusions or miss important patterns. Let me first explain to you how it was created. It was created by taking measurements of the strength and direction of gravity. Millions of pounds of stone very close to a detector will have a gravitational pull that can be detected by sensitive equipment. The denser the material, the stronger it will pull. This type of process is commonly used in large-scale construction projects to analyze the stability of underlying bedrock. In April 1986, a French team led by Jacques Montleconte and Pierre Delattre recorded about 2,000 measurements at various locations around and inside of the Great Pyramid. This allowed the group to come up with a density of the structure as a whole at about 2.05 grams per cubic centimeter, which was much lower than they had expected. This cannot be entirely explained by the known structures and is likely showing us that there are layers of tightly fitted walls known as puzzle stones that give the structure its strength with fairly loose filler stones in between, possibly mortared together or mixed with sand or gravel. This is how the Meidum Pyramid was constructed. In 1987, the data points were revisited with a new approach. The pyramid was sectioned into 34 roughly prism-shaped sections. Each section had about 700 individual gravity measurements associated with it, and an inverse gravitational formula was used to integrate them and come up with an average density for each section. The Cray 2 supercomputer was used to crunch all of this data. This gave them 34 values of density for various sections. I have no reason to question the gravimetric readings, and while I could not find the raw data or source code, the algorithm they used is well established and is nearly identical to formulas I use in my own profession. So I likewise have no reason to question the resulting density calculations. I have reached out to the only still living author, and if I get my hands on the raw data and source code, I will publish a follow-up video, as they also performed measurements and calculations deep inside the pyramid that may have their own interesting results. They had not published anything in the 1980s, other than a conference in Cairo in '87 and Athens in '88, and his 2012 book, Imaging the Cheops Pyramid, does not contain the raw data. So let's look at this image again. It was created by hand using markers. In terms of accurately presenting scientific data, I would rate this a 1 out of 10. In 40 years of being referenced, as far as I can tell, I'm the first person to not take it at face value and actually peer review its creation process. There even appears to have been a mistake in coloring one of the northwest bands. Let's address the problems and see if we can correct them. First off, 3 markers is not really useful in showing anything subtle, and a black and white version they published is even worse, as white represents a middle density for some reason. Let's take the calculated densities and programmatically create a color gradient. Let's make the densest volume pure red and the least dense region pure green, and create a smooth transition between them so we can get some idea of the density difference and spread. If you've seen my analysis of the ScanPyramids video, you'll know that graphics processing is something I'm very familiar with, so I wrote some C++ code to handle this. Much better. Now what about those obvious rings? Clearly, there is some sort of concentric structure of density differential inside the pyramid, right? No, not really. That's an illusion created by the projection. From the way the image is presented, it gives you the idea that you are looking down at a vertical cross-section of the pyramid from above. The 3D version makes it appear though you're looking down through the pyramid from the faces, but that's not what's being shown here either. To be fair, I would also have had a hard time representing this data in 1987, but I have way more powerful tools than they did. Allow me to break the illusion. So instead of simply updating the image given to us with generated gradients, what I've done is represent the data as a 3D model instead. This allows us to get a better idea for the relative density in various locations around the pyramid, and lets us see what was hidden behind overlapping sections. Now we can actually explore the various sections of the pyramid and speculate what the various densities could mean. There were never any thin lines or concentric rings, we just had large chunks overlapping each other. Here we encounter the counterintuitive truth I mentioned. Say you're looking for hidden chambers in this data. What would you look for? We're looking for air pockets, so you want sections of low density, right? Take a look at this block that they calculated separately from the rest. Notice this is actually the densest thing they calculated, despite containing both the downward passage and Robert's tunnel. Dr. Hoy theorized that perhaps the chevrons added some significant density to account for this discrepancy. He didn't know then that the chevrons actually conceal an even larger air pocket, and yet this section is the densest. The presence of the chevrons shows us that the ancient Egyptians were clearly thinking about reinforcing the entranceway. So I think the most likely reason for the increased density is that this region is made entirely of squared stones stacked flush against each other, as opposed to roughly piled up. Something like these sugar cubes. The box of loose cubes is the same amount of sugar as the tightly packed cubes, but takes up way more volume and is not as strong. This is my first discovery. In order to make this section this dense, nearly the entire thing must be squared stones. It would appear to me that the thickness of internal structures is far greater than is expected. Why did the air shafts give the Grand Gallery such a wide berth? Why was this unfinished pyramid's trench so much wider than a regular passage? Because the Egyptians didn't line their corridors with one or two flush stones. They packed meters of stone around it before switching to the more effective rubble fill. So, once I realized we were looking for structures via sections of overdensity, I began to look at the 3D model I created, and broke it up and look at it in different ways. The first thing I noticed was at the bottom, the southwest side was denser than everything else. If you're wondering, the bottom layer they calculated is actually the bedrock. The second layer is the start of the pyramid. I separated them on the right and combined them on the left, except for that the diagrams are 1-to-1. I'd initially thought this could be rainwater, as there was heavy thunderstorms on April 1st, 2nd, and 7th of 1986, and the winds tend to always come from this side. I suppose some of the density fluctuations could be trapped rainwater, but then I noticed as you go up the layers, the location of the highest density seems to move. Remember that the redder an area is the denser, so in the next floor slides, watch how it moves. It first goes up the west side and then crosses over the entranceway, then makes its way from northeast to southeast. The densest section is then in the southwest. Then it makes it back to where it started. And possibly one more turn at the top. This isn't Houdin's internal spiral ramp. There's no evidence for that. The resolution of the data just isn't good enough to even consider it, but there does seem to be an area of higher density making a single rotation around the pyramid. I thought to myself, this couldn't be a ramp. There's no way it's just been sitting in the data for 40 years and wasn't noticed because of the limitations of the presentation, was it? And then I noticed something else. Directly above each section of overdensity is a section of underdensity. This pattern follows all the way up the pyramid and spirals around it. This blew my mind because I could already see a theory coming together. The ramps were made of well-fitting blocks in order to make them as stable as possible for everything that had to happen on top of them. They also would have been built far wider than necessary, like they appear to have done with everything else based on the overdense entrance section. The relative volume of the overdensity in each section must be significantly higher than the ratio of overdensity for all the known structures within the core. So we're talking about structures that would dwarf the Grand Gallery. While dragging stones up the ramp, water and sand was constantly being poured onto it to reduce friction. This further added to the density as sand managed to fill every nook and cranny and be constantly packed down. It appears to me that the ramp comes from the southwest where the quarry was, then spirals up, making a single revolution around the pyramid. In my video of the G3B pyramid, I mentioned that I believe that it was intended to be smoothed and that the 4 steps was an intermediate phase that all pyramids have. We can see a step-like structure in Menkauri's pyramid thanks to its scar. I think the evidence in the density readings is showing us that the construction process of the Great Pyramid included 4 steps, possibly 5. They built a 4 or 5 layer step pyramid with a ramp on one side of each. This allowed 3 faces of each step to be completed in their entirety, and the final edge was completed last, covering over the ramp, leaving an ultra-dense ramp foundation underneath the lightest fill material. That's what the data seems to show. I want to leave off with a plea. If you are doing novel work in any scientific field, please publish and save your raw data, not just your results. It appears to me like the authors either didn't know how or didn't have the computing power to use the internal measurements for their full pyramid calculations, which is where the detail lies. I have trillions of times the processing power they did and new algorithms to take advantage of it. If I had the actual measurements, I could generate a fresh set of voxels with a level of detail orders of magnitudes greater than they did, without any new measurements being taken, just more advanced software. Astronomers still make discoveries in 50-year-old Mars lander data and 30-year-old Hubble images. Publish your raw. You never know what future technology may be able to read further into it than you ever hoped to. So, from just wondering what this image even meant 6 months ago, my re-examination of the measurements taken in 1986 may have presented 2 new ideas regarding construction. Firstly, that foundations and internal structures are much larger than we thought, and that the Great Pyramid was constructed with 4, maybe 5 steps, each supporting a ramp. Thank you for listening. Respectfully discuss my ideas or post your own in the comments, and subscribe if you wish to continue to explore our distant ancestors with me.